The carriage wheels had barely stopped turning when the shouting began inside Ashcombe Hall. Eleanor Hartley stood frozen on the gravel drive, her single trunk still strapped to the back of the coach, as a maid came rushing out the front doors with her cap askew and her face pale as chalk. "You cannot go in there right now," the maid said, grabbing Eleanor's sleeve before she could even greet anyone properly. "His Grace is in one of his moods. Best you wait out here until it passes." "What kind of mood requires a guest to wait on the drive?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer. From somewhere beyond the tall oak doors came a voice, low and controlled, yet sharp enough to cut through stone. It was not shouting, not exactly. It was worse than shouting. It was the voice of a man who had learned, over many years, to keep his anger folded so tightly inside himself that when it finally showed, it came out cold rather than loud. "I said the accounts are to be reviewed by Friday, not discussed at length over tea," the voice said. "This is not a debate, Mr. Griggs. It is an instruction." A door closed somewhere inside, firm and final, and the household seemed to exhale all at once. The maid released Eleanor's sleeve. "That will be the Duke," she said quietly, as if his name itself might summon him back. "You'll want to remember, miss, he does not raise his voice. He does not need to. 10 years of silence taught this house to listen for smaller things." Eleanor did not fully understand what the girl meant, not yet. She had come to Ashcombe Hall because her family's fortune had collapsed the previous winter, leaving her with two choices: marry a man twice her age for his money, or find honest work using the only skills she possessed, which were patience, a good education, and an unfortunate habit of speaking her mind at the worst possible moments. She had chosen the second option, and a letter from a distant cousin had brought her here, to serve as companion and tutor to a child she had never met, in the home of a man everyone in the county spoke of only in hushed, careful tones. The Duke of Ashcombe, Edmund Radcliffe, a name that made older women lower their voices and younger ones grow strangely quiet. Eleanor was led through the entrance hall by the same maid, whose name she soon learned was Peggy. The hall itself was beautiful in the way that grand old houses often are, full of polished wood and tall windows, yet there was something missing from it that Eleanor could not name at first. It took her a full minute of walking through the corridor to understand what it was. There were no portraits of laughter anywhere. Every painted face along the walls stared down with formal, practiced calm, and even the family portraits near the staircase, the ones that should have held some warmth, some softness between a husband and wife, showed only careful distance, except for one. Near the top of the staircase hung a portrait unlike the others. A young woman with fair hair and a gentle, unguarded smile, painted in a style far less formal than the rest. Eleanor slowed her steps without meaning to. "That is the late Duchess," Peggy said, following her gaze. "Lady Catherine. She passed some 10 years back now. Carriage accident, out past the North Road, in winter. His Grace was driving that night." Eleanor said nothing, but something in her chest tightened at the plain way Peggy delivered this information, as though it were simply a fact of the house, like the number of chimneys or the age of the oldest tree in the garden, a fact everyone knew and no one discussed. 10 years, Eleanor repeated softly. 10 years exactly. "Come winter," Peggy said. "And in all that time, miss, I have never once seen him smile. Not at Christmas, not at his own daughter's birthday, not even when good news arrives from the estate. He is a fair master, mind you, never cruel. But there is a difference between fairness and warmth, and this house has forgotten the second one entirely." They reached a smaller sitting room near the east wing, where a girl of perhaps 8 years sat alone at a table, arranging a set of wooden blocks into careful, orderly rows rather than building anything with them. She looked up when the door opened, and Eleanor was struck immediately by how old her eyes seemed for such a young face. "You must be Rosalind," Eleanor said, kneeling down so she would not tower over the child. "I am Eleanor. I understand I am to be your new companion, and perhaps, if you will allow it, your friend as well." Rosalind studied her for a long moment before answering. "Governesses do not usually ask permission to be friends," she said. "They simply arrive, and then they leave when father grows tired of them. How many governesses have there been?" "4, Rosalind said, returning her attention to the blocks. "The first one cried too much. The second one tried to make me call her Mama, which I did not like. The third one was frightened of father, and left after 2 weeks. I do not remember the fourth one very well. She was not here long enough to matter." Eleanor felt a small ache settle in her chest, though she kept her expression light. "Well, I do not intend to cry. I have no interest in being called Mama, and I am not easily frightened. I cannot promise how long I will stay, but I can promise that while I am here, I will try to make it worth remembering." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Rosalind's face that might have been curiosity, or perhaps the smallest, most cautious hope. It vanished quickly, replaced by the same careful neutrality Eleanor would come to recognize as the language of this entire household. Everyone here had learned to hide what they felt, because feeling too openly seemed to invite disappointment. That evening, Eleanor was informed she would dine with the family, a courtesy she had not expected given her modest position in the household. She dressed in her best gown, which was several seasons out of fashion, and made her way down to the dining hall with Peggy's whispered instructions echoing in her mind. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not mention the late Duchess. Do not ask personal questions. Above all, do not expect conversation, for His Grace prefers silence at meals. The dining hall was long and formal, lit by candles that threw more shadow than light across the polished table. The Duke was already seated at the head of it when Eleanor entered, and she had her first proper look at the man the entire county spoke of in careful whispers. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps not yet 40, though something in the set of his shoulders and the stillness of his face made him seem older. His hair was dark, threaded faintly with gray at the temples, and his eyes, when they briefly met hers across the room, were the color of a winter sky just before snow, gray and distant and giving away nothing at all. "Miss Hartley," he said, rising slightly as courtesy demanded, though the gesture felt more like an obligation completed than a welcome extended. "I trust your journey was tolerable." "It was, Your Grace. Thank you for asking." "Good." He sat again, and that appeared to be the end of his interest in conversation. He turned his attention to the papers beside his plate, reading them even as the first course was served, and the meal proceeded in a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the soft scrape of cutlery against porcelain and little else. Rosalind sat across from her father, eating in small, careful bites, never once looking up from her plate. She did not attempt to speak to him, and he did not attempt to speak to her, and Eleanor realized with a growing sense of sadness that this was simply how meals proceeded in this house. Two people sharing a table, bound by blood and grief, yet separated by a silence neither one seemed to know how to break. Eleanor, who had never in her life been comfortable with silence, found herself unable to bear it for long. "The gardens looked lovely as we came up the drive," she said, addressing no one in particular. "I noticed a rose bed near the fountain that must be spectacular come summer." The Duke did not look up from his papers. "The head gardener maintains them well." "Do you enjoy gardens, Your Grace?" This time he did look up, and there was something in his expression that was not quite annoyance, but bordered close to it, a kind of weary surprise that anyone would ask him such a question at his own dinner table. "I enjoy them functioning as they should, Miss Hartley. I do not spend a great deal of time considering whether I enjoy them beyond that." "That seems a shame," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "A garden is meant to be more than functional. It is meant to bring some pleasure to whoever walks through it." The silence that followed was different from the one before it, heavier somehow, and Eleanor understood immediately that she had said something wrong, though she could not have said precisely what. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he set down his fork with a precision that felt more pointed than the action required. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that had not been there a moment before, "I would ask that you save your observations about pleasure in gardens for someone with the time to indulge in them. This household has responsibilities that do not permit such luxuries." "Forgive me, Your Grace, I meant no offense." "None taken," he said, in a tone that suggested the opposite entirely. He returned to his papers, and the meal finished in a silence even more absolute than before, broken only by the occasional clink of a glass being set down too firmly. Later that night, as Eleanor prepared for bed in the modest room she had been given near the nursery wing, she found herself staring at the ceiling, turning the strange evening over in her mind. She thought of the portrait on the staircase, the young woman with the gentle, unguarded smile. She thought of Rosalind's careful, joyless blocks, arranged in rows rather than built into anything. She thought of the Duke's gray eyes, distant as a winter sky, and the way his voice had gone cold the moment she mentioned something as simple as pleasure. 10 years, Peggy had said. 10 years since anyone in this house had seen him smile. Eleanor did not know yet what had brought her to Ashcombe Hall beyond simple necessity, but as she lay in the darkness listening to the old house settle around her, she felt a strange, stubborn certainty take root inside her chest. She had never been very good at leaving silence alone. She doubted very much that she would start now. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed softly, and then the house fell still, wrapped once again in the same careful quiet it had worn for 10 long years. By the end of Eleanor's second week at Ashcombe Hall, she had already broken 3 rules that Peggy had carefully explained to her on the first day, and she was beginning to suspect she would break several more before the month was out. The first rule she broke was small. Rosalind's lesson schedule, which had been drawn up years earlier by a governess long since departed, dedicated 2 full hours each morning to needlework and penmanship, and only 20 minutes to anything resembling arithmetic or geography. Eleanor took one look at the schedule, decided it was designed to keep a child quiet rather than to teach her anything useful, and rearranged it entirely, without asking permission from anyone. "Your father will not approve," Rosalind said on the first morning of the new schedule, watching Eleanor sketch a rough map of the county on a slate board. "Your father does not need to approve of everything," Eleanor said. "He simply needs to see that it works." It did work, as it happened. Rosalind, who had shown little enthusiasm for needlework, proved to have a sharp mind for numbers and an even sharper curiosity about the wider world beyond Ashcombe's gates. Within days she was asking questions about distant countries, about rivers and mountain ranges, about why the moon changed shape through the month, questions that no one, it seemed, had ever bothered answering for her before. Eleanor found herself staying up late reading through the estate's dusty library simply to keep pace with the child's curiosity, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt something like purpose settle into her days. The second rule she broke concerned volume. Eleanor had never in her life been a quiet person, and she found the hushed, careful atmosphere of Ashcombe Hall almost physically uncomfortable to maintain. She laughed at things that struck her as funny, even when no one else in the room seemed to find them so. She hummed while she walked the corridors. She once startled an elderly footman nearly out of his shoes by greeting him cheerfully from around a corner, an act that apparently had not occurred in that particular hallway in living memory. The third rule, and the one that caused the most trouble, was the rule about the Duke himself. Eleanor had been told, in no uncertain terms, to keep her distance from His Grace, to speak only when addressed, and above all, never to ask him questions of a personal nature. She had tried, in her own way, to follow this instruction, but there was something about the man's rigid formality that provoked in her an almost irresistible urge to test its edges, the way one might press a thumb against a bruise simply to see how much it still hurt. It began, as these things often do, with something entirely unremarkable. Eleanor had taken to walking with Rosalind through the gardens each afternoon, partly for the fresh air, and partly because she had noticed the child seemed to breathe easier outside the house than within it, as though the walls themselves pressed down on her in ways the open sky did not. On one such afternoon they came upon the Duke standing near the stables, speaking in low tones with a man Eleanor did not recognize, his expression drawn tight with some evident frustration. "There has been a problem with the tenant farms along the eastern border," Rosalind explained quietly, before Eleanor could ask. "Father worries about them a great deal, and does not like to show it, but I can always tell." Eleanor watched the exchange from a respectful distance, and something in the Duke's posture, the way his shoulders held such careful tension even when discussing something as ordinary as farmland, struck her as unbearably sad. Here was a man who could not even let his frustration show plainly, who folded every emotion into the same rigid, controlled shape regardless of what it actually was. That evening at dinner, emboldened by a day of small victories in the schoolroom, Eleanor made the mistake of asking him directly about it. "Rosalind mentioned there has been trouble with the tenant farms," she said, keeping her tone as light as she could manage. "I hope it is nothing too serious." The Duke's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "That is not a matter that concerns the schoolroom, Miss Hartley." "I only meant to ask out of concern, Your Grace, not to pry." "Concern is easily mistaken for prying when it is uninvited," he said, setting his fork down with the same deliberate precision she had noticed before, the precision of a man who used small, controlled movements to keep something larger from spilling out. "I would ask that you confine your concern to my daughter's education, which is, after all, what you were engaged to provide." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, not entirely with embarrassment. There was something about his tone, so certain of its own correctness, so utterly unwilling to acknowledge that a person might simply care without an ulterior motive, that struck her as unfair. "Forgive me for saying so, Your Grace," she said, "but concern does not require an invitation. It is not a formal call that must be scheduled in advance." Rosalind's eyes went very wide across the table, and even the footman standing near the sideboard seemed to hold his breath. The Duke looked at Eleanor properly then, perhaps for the first time since her arrival, his gray eyes narrowing slightly with something that might have been irritation or might have been surprise at being spoken to so plainly in his own home. "You are very free with your opinions for someone in your position, Miss Hartley." "I am aware of that, Your Grace. It has been remarked upon before, and not always kindly. But I find that pretending not to notice things rarely improves them." For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Eleanor braced herself for the sharp dismissal she felt certain was coming. Instead, something unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth twitched. Just barely, the ghost of an expression that vanished almost before it fully formed, as though he had caught himself feeling something and immediately stamped it out. "Finish your dinner, Miss Hartley," he said finally, and though his voice remained cool, there was something less sharp in it than before. "We will discuss the schoolroom schedule tomorrow, since you have apparently already redesigned it without my knowledge." "I was going to mention that eventually," Eleanor admitted. "I do not doubt it," he said, and returned to his meal, though Eleanor thought, or perhaps only hoped, that the silence which followed felt slightly less heavy than the silences that had come before. The days that followed settled into an uneasy but functioning rhythm. The Duke reviewed Eleanor's revised schedule the next morning, read through it with the same careful attention he gave to his account books, and approved it without comment beyond a single raised eyebrow at the reduced hours dedicated to needlework. He did not thank her for the improvement in Rosalind's enthusiasm for learning, though Eleanor noticed he began asking his daughter small questions at dinner about what she had studied that day, questions delivered with the same formal reserve as everything else he said, but questions nonetheless, which was more than had existed before. Eleanor began to notice other things too, small cracks in the careful composure the Duke wore like armor. She noticed that he lingered longer than necessary near the portrait of his late wife on the staircase, pausing there most mornings on his way to his study, though he never once acknowledged doing so if anyone happened to see him. She noticed that certain rooms in the house remained closed off entirely, their doors kept shut year-round, and when she asked Peggy about them, the maid grew unusually quiet and simply said that His Grace preferred them that way. She noticed too the way Rosalind watched her father across every room they occupied together, with a hunger that had nothing to do with affection withheld out of cruelty, and everything to do with a grief neither of them knew how to share with the other. The child loved her father, that much was plain, but she had learned, the way children often learn things they should never have to learn so young, that loving him openly seemed to cause him pain rather than comfort, and so she had folded her own affection into the same careful, guarded shape he used, believing perhaps that this was simply what love looked like in this house. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into Eleanor's time at Ashcombe, she came upon the Duke alone in the small sitting room where Rosalind took her lessons, standing before a shelf of the girls' completed workbooks, leafing through one with an expression Eleanor had not seen on him before, something almost soft. "She has a quick mind," Eleanor said from the doorway, not wanting to startle him. He closed the workbook at once, as though caught doing something he should not have been doing. "She takes after her mother in that respect," he said, and then, as if surprised by his own words, fell silent. It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife directly in Eleanor's presence, and she understood instinctively that she should tread carefully here, that this fragile admission was not an invitation to press further, but a rare, unguarded moment that might close as quickly as it had opened. "She is fortunate to have inherited that from someone," Eleanor said simply. The Duke studied her for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether her words carried some hidden edge, some attempt to pry further into grief he had spent 10 years keeping carefully sealed. Apparently satisfied that they did not, he nodded once, set the workbook back on its shelf with careful hands, and left the room without another word. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet sitting room for some time afterward, thinking about the strange, careful dance this household performed every single day. The way grief had settled so completely into its walls and its silences that even small moments of warmth had to be handled like fragile, breakable things. She thought of the Duke's twitching almost smile at dinner, quickly suppressed. She thought of Rosalind's watchful eyes, always measuring the distance between herself and her father, never quite closing it. She thought of the closed doors along the west corridor and the portrait he paused before each morning, without ever admitting that he did. Something in this house was waiting to break open, Eleanor thought. Some carefully held tension that could not sustain itself forever. She did not yet know what would cause it to finally give way, but she found herself, against every warning Peggy had given her, almost looking forward to finding out. That night, as she readied herself for bed, she caught her own reflection in the small mirror above her washstand and realized, with some surprise, that she was smiling. It had been an odd sort of day, full of small frictions and small unexpected softenings, and yet something about it had left her feeling more useful, more present, more herself than she had felt in the long, uncertain months since her family's fortune had collapsed. Ashcombe Hall was not an easy house to live in. Its silences were heavy, its grief was old and deeply rooted, and its master guarded himself against feeling with a discipline that bordered on the extraordinary. But Eleanor Hartley had never been the sort of person who backed away from difficult things simply because they were difficult, and as she blew out her candle and settled into the darkness, she found herself wondering, not for the first time, what it might take to see that rare, suppressed twitch at the corner of the Duke's mouth bloom into something fuller, something real. A few days later, news arrived that would set that very dinner into motion, though Eleanor did not yet understand its significance when Peggy first mentioned it, while helping her mend a torn hem in the sewing room. "Lady Constance Pemberton is coming to stay," Peggy said, her needle pausing mid-stitch, her voice dropping the way it always did whenever she spoke of anything the household considered delicate. His Grace's aunt on his mother's side. She visits perhaps once a year, and every time she does, the whole house holds its breath until she leaves again. "What manner of woman is she?" Eleanor asked, though something in Peggy's tone had already told her most of what she needed to know. "The sort who believes her opinion carries the weight of law," Peggy said. "She has never approved of how His Grace runs this household since her ladyship passed. Thinks he grieves too visibly for a man of his station, and yet not properly enough, both at once, if you can make sense of that. She will have something to say about you as well, miss. Mark my words. New companions in this house rarely escape her notice." Eleanor did not know quite what to make of this warning, though she filed it away carefully alongside everything else she had learned about the delicate architecture of Ashcombe Hall. She had grown accustomed over these past weeks to the household's careful rules and unspoken boundaries, and she found herself wondering whether Lady Constance's visit would test those boundaries in ways the quiet routine of daily life had not yet managed to do. She mentioned the coming visit to Rosalind that same afternoon, curious whether the child shared her governess's evident dread. "Great Aunt Constance always brings a great many trunks and even more opinions," Rosalind said, with the flat, resigned tone of a child who had learned to endure rather than enjoy family visits. "She tells father he should remarry for my sake, and then tells me I should be more like the daughters of families she approves of. And by the time she leaves, everyone in the house is tired, in a way that has nothing to do with sleep." "That sounds exhausting," Eleanor said honestly. "It is," Rosalind agreed. "But father says family obligations must be honored, regardless of how tiring they prove to be. He says that a great deal, actually. About all sorts of things." Eleanor thought about that phrase for the rest of the day. Family obligations must be honored, regardless of how tiring they prove to be, and wondered how much of the Duke's entire life had been built upon exactly that principle. Duty carried forward long after joy had been quietly set aside. It seemed to her a heavy way to live, honoring obligation while starving everything else that made a life feel worth living, and she found herself hoping, in a way she could not quite explain even to herself, that Lady Constance's visit might somehow crack that principle open, rather than reinforce it further. She fell asleep that night still wondering, unaware that the answer to her earlier question, what it might take to see that rare, suppressed twitch at the corner of the Duke's mouth bloom into something fuller, was closer than she imagined, and that it would arrive not through careful planning or patient effort, but through a single, entirely accidental moment at a dinner table not many weeks away. Lady Constance Pemberton arrived at Ashcombe Hall on a Thursday afternoon with 4 trunks, a lady's maid, and an expression that suggested she had already found something to disapprove of before she had even stepped down from her carriage. "Edmund," she said, extending a gloved hand toward the Duke as though bestowing a great honor upon him by allowing him to greet her. "You look thin. Grief has never suited a man's appetite, and it certainly has not improved yours over the years." "Aunt Constance," the Duke said, with the careful, practiced tone Eleanor recognized as his particular way of tolerating rather than welcoming. "You look well. I look my age, which is more than can be said for how this house has aged around you." Her sharp eyes swept the entrance hall, cataloging every detail with visible judgment, before finally settling on Eleanor, who stood a respectful distance away with Rosalind's hand in hers. "And this must be the new companion I have heard mentioned in your last letter. Miss Hartley, is it?" "Yes, my lady," Eleanor said, offering a small curtsy. Lady Constance studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, the way one might examine a piece of furniture being considered for purchase. "You are younger than I expected, and your gown, if you will forgive my saying so, is at least 2 seasons out of fashion." "I am afraid fashion has never been a priority I could afford, my lady," Eleanor said, keeping her tone pleasant despite the obvious barb. "I have found honesty considerably more useful than embroidery." Something flickered across the Duke's face at that, gone as quickly as it appeared, but Lady Constance did not seem to notice, already moving past Eleanor toward Rosalind, whom she inspected with the same critical eye. "You have grown," she announced, as though this were somehow both a surprise and a mild disappointment. "Though you are still too quiet for a girl your age. Your mother, God rest her, was never quiet a day in her life. She filled every room she entered." Eleanor watched Rosalind's small shoulders tighten at the mention of her mother, and she watched the Duke's jaw do the very same thing. the two of them mirroring each other's careful, silent pain without either one acknowledging the other's suffering. It was, Eleanor thought, one of the saddest things she had witnessed since arriving at Ashcombe, this shared grief that somehow kept them further apart, rather than drawing them closer together. The days that followed Lady Constance's arrival proved every bit as exhausting as Rosalind had predicted. She commented on the state of the gardens, the quality of the meals, the arrangement of the furniture in the drawing room, and most persistently of all, on the Duke's continued unmarried state, a subject she raised at nearly every meal, with the tenacity of a woman who genuinely believed repetition might eventually produce results. "You cannot mourn forever, Edmund," she said one evening over soup, not for the first time that week. 10 years is a decade. It is long enough. The county has begun to whisper that you intend to spend your entire life alone, and frankly, it reflects poorly on the family name. "The county may whisper whatever it likes, Aunt Constance," the Duke said, his voice level but tight. "I have never governed my life according to gossip, and I do not intend to begin now. You govern it according to grief instead, which is hardly an improvement." Lady Constance set down her spoon with a decisive clink. "Catherine has been gone 10 years. Rosalind needs a mother, this house needs a mistress, and you, my dear boy, need something other than ledgers and silence to occupy your evenings." Eleanor, seated further down the table, watched the Duke's knuckles whiten slightly around his own spoon, though his expression betrayed nothing beyond his usual composed reserve. She felt a fierce, protective urge rise in her chest, entirely unbidden, and had to remind herself firmly that this was not her conversation to enter. It was on the 4th evening of Lady Constance's visit that everything changed. The dinner had been arranged with particular formality that night, as several of the Duke's relatives from a neighboring estate had been invited to join them, partly at Lady Constance's insistence, since she had declared it high time the family reminded the county that Ashcombe remained a stable and respectable household, despite what she called its unfortunate reputation for gloom. The long table was set with the finest china, extra candles had been lit along its length, and even the kitchen staff had been instructed to prepare dishes well beyond the household's usual modest fare. Eleanor had not expected to be included at such a formal gathering, given her position, but Rosalind had insisted, quietly but firmly, that her companion sit beside her, and the Duke, perhaps not wishing to argue the point in front of his relatives, had allowed it without comment. The evening began tensely, and only grew more so as it progressed. Lady Constance, emboldened by the presence of an audience, took the opportunity to interrogate Eleanor at considerable length about her family background, her education, her prospects, and her intentions, questions delivered in a tone that made clear she expected each answer to confirm some unflattering suspicion she had already formed. "And your father, Miss Hartley," Lady Constance said, cutting delicately into her meat. "What precisely was his occupation before your family's unfortunate decline?" "He was a solicitor, my lady," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. "A respectable one, though not, I confess, a particularly wealthy one." "A solicitor." Lady Constance repeated the word, as though tasting something faintly unpleasant. "And now his daughter serves as companion to a duke's child. How the world does turn." "It does indeed, my lady," Eleanor said, "though I confess I have always found turning preferable to standing still." A ripple of quiet amusement passed among the younger relatives seated further down the table, quickly suppressed under Lady Constance's sharp glance. The older woman's eyes narrowed, sensing perhaps that she was losing ground in whatever contest she believed herself to be waging, and she pressed forward with renewed determination. "Tell me, Miss Hartley, do you consider it appropriate for a young woman of your background to speak so freely at a duke's table? In my day, companions understood their place far better than yours appears to." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure begin to slip, not from anger exactly, but from the exhausting effort of holding her tongue against provocation delivered so persistently, and with such evident enjoyment. She opened her mouth to offer some measured, polite response, reached for her water glass to buy herself a moment to compose it properly, and in doing so, her sleeve caught the edge of a nearby decanter of red wine that a footman had only just set down beside her place setting. The decanter tipped. Eleanor made a desperate grab for it, missed, and watched in mounting horror as a dark red stain spread rapidly across the white tablecloth, narrowly avoiding Lady Constance's silk gown by a matter of inches that felt, in the moment, entirely too close for comfort. "Oh no," Eleanor said, her voice rising in genuine distress as she snatched up her napkin and began dabbing uselessly at the spreading stain, only making it worse. "Oh, I am so sorry. I did not mean. That is, my sleeve. It's simply, oh dear." The table fell into a horrified hush. Somewhere down its length, a young cousin stifled what might have been a laugh into a cough. Lady Constance had gone rigid in her seat, her expression frozen somewhere between outrage and disbelief, as though the universe itself had personally conspired to insult her. "Well," Lady Constance said, in a voice that had gone dangerously flat, "I suppose this confirms every concern I have expressed this evening regarding proper conduct at table." And it was here, in the middle of her own mortification, with wine soaking rapidly into fine white linen and every eye at the table fixed upon her, that Eleanor did the thing that would change the course of the entire household's future, though she could never afterward fully explain what possessed her to do it. Flustered beyond all sense, still dabbing frantically and uselessly at the stain, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin in a perfect imitation of Lady Constance's most severe posture, and said, in a voice pitched to mimic the older woman's precise, clipped tone with an accuracy that surprised even herself, "I suppose this confirms every concern I have ever expressed about literally anything, ever, at any time, regarding any subject whatsoever." The words hung in the air for a single suspended moment. Then the Duke of Ashcombe laughed. It was not a polite chuckle, not a small, controlled acknowledgement of a joke delivered for form's sake. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, bursting out of him with a force that seemed to surprise him every bit as much as it surprised everyone else at the table. He clapped a hand briefly over his mouth as though trying to physically contain it, but it was already loose in the room, warm and startling, and entirely unlike anything anyone present had heard from him in living memory. The younger cousins, released from their forced composure, broke into open laughter of their own. Even the footman standing near the sideboard turned quickly away, his shoulders shaking with poorly concealed amusement. Lady Constance sat rigid and unamused amid the sudden eruption of mirth, her face reddening with an outrage that only seemed to make the situation funnier to everyone else at the table. Rosalind, seated beside Eleanor, stared at her father with an expression of pure, wide-eyed astonishment, as though she were witnessing something impossible, something she had begun to believe existed only in old memories too faded to trust. Her father, laughing, really laughing, the sound filling the dining hall in a way she could not remember it ever doing before, not once in all the years she could recall. The laughter lasted only a few seconds, perhaps 5, perhaps 10, but it felt to everyone present like something far longer, a crack of light breaking suddenly through a window that had been shuttered for a decade. And then, almost as quickly as it had come, the Duke seemed to catch himself. His hand, which had been braced against the table, tightened. The laughter died in his throat, replaced almost instantly by something that looked uncomfortably like shame, as though he had been caught doing something shameful rather than simply human. He cleared his throat, straightened in his chair, and reached for his water glass with hands that were not quite steady. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rough. "That was unexpected." "It was wonderful," said one of the young cousins, before quickly falling silent under Lady Constance's withering glance. Lady Constance recovered her composure with visible effort, smoothing the front of her gown as though the laughter itself had left some physical residue upon it that needed correcting. "I fail to see what was so amusing about ruined linen and disrespectful mimicry," she said stiffly. "Now, though I suppose I should not be surprised that this household finds humor in such things, given how little else it seems to find humor in these days." The remark, clearly intended to sting, seemed to land differently than she perhaps intended. The Duke did not respond with his usual careful deflection. Instead, something in his expression shifted, hardened slightly, though not toward Eleanor this time. "Miss Hartley meant no disrespect, Aunt Constance," he said quietly, "and I would remind you that you are a guest in this house, not its governor." A ripple of surprise passed through the assembled relatives at that, quiet murmurs exchanged behind raised hands, and Lady Constance's mouth pressed into a thin, offended line, though she said nothing further on the matter for the remainder of the meal. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat frozen in her seat, the ruined tablecloth still spread before her, her cheeks burning with a complicated mixture of embarrassment and something else entirely, something warmer and more unsettling that she did not yet have a name for. She had not meant to cause a scene. She certainly had not meant to make the Duke of Ashcombe laugh in front of his entire assembled family after 10 years of careful, guarded silence, and yet she had, and something about the astonished, almost wondering look that had crossed his face before the shame set in, told her that this small, accidental moment had cracked something open that would not easily close again. The rest of the dinner passed in relative quiet, though it was a different quiet than before, less heavy somehow, as though the room itself had been permitted to exhale. The Duke did not laugh again, did not so much as smile for the remainder of the evening, retreating instead into a careful formality that felt, to Eleanor's eyes, almost defensive in nature, as though he were hurriedly rebuilding a wall that had briefly, unexpectedly crumbled. Later that night, as the household finally settled into sleep and the last candles were extinguished throughout the halls, Eleanor lay awake in her narrow bed, replaying the moment again and again in her mind. She thought of the Duke's hand clapped over his mouth, too late to contain what had already escaped. She thought of Rosalind's wide, astonished eyes. She thought of the way his laughter had sounded, not like the practiced amusement of a man performing politeness, but like something real breaking free after a very long time buried. She did not know, lying there in the darkness, whether she had done something wonderful or something terrible. She only knew, with a certainty that unsettled her more than she cared to admit, that nothing at Ashcombe Hall would feel quite the same again. Down the corridor, in his own chambers, the Duke of Ashcombe sat alone by a dying fire, staring into its embers with an expression no one was present to witness. His chest still carried the strange, unfamiliar ache of laughter, a sensation so foreign after 10 years that it felt almost like grief itself, and beneath that ache sat something else entirely, something he did not yet have the courage to examine too closely. He thought of Catherine's portrait on the staircase, her gentle, unguarded smile. He thought of the sound that had come out of him at the dinner table, sudden and involuntary, and of how frightened he had felt in the instant after it escaped, as though joy itself were a betrayal he could not afford to commit. By morning, word of what had happened at dinner had already traveled through every corridor and servants' passage in Ashcombe Hall, the way such things always did in a house where little else of interest ever occurred. Eleanor descended the staircase to find Peggy waiting near the bottom, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Is it true, miss?" Peggy asked, keeping her voice low despite the empty hall around them. "Is it true?" His Grace laughed at dinner. "Old Mrs. Whitfield says she heard it clear through to the kitchen passage, and she has worked in this house 19 years, and never once heard the like." "It is true," Eleanor admitted, feeling her cheeks warm again at the memory. "Though I fear it happened at Lady Constance's expense, and I do not think she has forgiven me for it." "Forgiven you?" Peggy's eyes widened further. "Miss, you might have made history in this house. There are footmen who were not even born when the old Duchess passed, and even they have heard the stories about how this place used to sound before the accident. Music in the evenings, laughter carrying up from the drawing room. It has been silent so long some of the younger staff thought perhaps His Grace simply did not know how anymore." Eleanor considered this as she made her way toward the schoolroom, where Rosalind was already waiting, seated at the small table with her workbooks arranged before her, though she was not looking at them. She looked up the moment Eleanor entered, and her expression held none of its usual careful reserve. "You made Father laugh," Rosalind said, the words tumbling out before Eleanor had even closed the door behind her. "I have never heard him laugh. Not once. I did not think he still knew how." "It was an accident," Eleanor said gently, settling into the chair across from her. "I did not mean to embarrass anyone, least of all your great-aunt." "I do not care about Great-Aunt Constance," Rosalind said, with a fierce honesty that startled Eleanor slightly. "I care that Father laughed. He looked like someone else for a moment, someone I think I remember from when I was very small, though I am not certain if that is a true memory or something I only wish were true." She paused, twisting her fingers together in her lap. "Do you think he will do it again?" Eleanor did not have an honest answer to that question, not one she felt certain enough to offer a child who had already learned to guard her hopes so carefully. "I do not know," she said finally, "but I think perhaps it matters less whether he does it again soon, and more that he now knows he still can. Sometimes that is enough to build something upon." Rosalind considered this with the same serious, measuring expression she brought to every difficult problem in her lessons, turning it over as though it were a sum that needed careful solving. "I hope you are right," she said at last. "I have been waiting a long time for something to change in this house, Miss Hartley. I had almost stopped believing it would." The words settled heavily in Eleanor's chest, heavier than she had expected from so young a voice, and she found herself reaching across the table to squeeze the child's small hand, an act of comfort that Rosalind, rather than pulling away from as she might have done weeks earlier, allowed without hesitation. Neither of them saw the Duke pass by the schoolroom door a moment later, pausing just beyond its threshold where neither could observe him, having come to check on his daughter's progress as he occasionally did at that hour. He had heard enough of the conversation to understand what had passed between them, and he stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, his hand resting against the doorframe, before turning quietly away and returning to his study without entering the room at all. He was not yet ready, it seemed, to face what his own unguarded laughter had begun to unravel, but he no longer walked away from it quite as quickly as he once might have, and that small, uncertain hesitation was, though he did not yet recognize it himself, the very first sign that something long frozen inside him had, however slightly, begun to thaw. The letter arrived on a gray morning nearly 3 weeks after Lady Constance had finally departed Ashcombe Hall, and it arrived, as such letters often seem to, at precisely the moment when the household had begun to believe the worst of its recent troubles lay behind it. Eleanor did not learn of its contents immediately. She only knew, from the way Peggy's face had gone pale when summoned to deliver a tray of coffee to the Duke's study that afternoon, and from the unusual sound of raised voices, actually raised this time, carrying faintly down the corridor from behind his closed door, that something had gone badly wrong. It was Rosalind who first told her what had happened, finding Eleanor in the schoolroom that evening with tears standing unshed in her eyes, a sight that alarmed Eleanor far more than anything the child had shown her since her arrival. "Cousin Aldous has written to father," Rosalind said, her voice unsteady. "Lord Aldous Fenwick. He is some manner of distant relation. I have never met him properly. But he says in the letter that father is unfit to raise me. He says father's household has become improper, and that having you here is scandalous, and that he intends to petition for guardianship over me if things do not change." Eleanor felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath her feet. "Guardianship," she repeated, "over you." "Father has not said much about it," Rosalind continued, wiping quickly at her eyes as though embarrassed by her own tears. "But I heard him shouting at Mr. Griggs earlier, which he never does. And I heard your name mentioned. And I am frightened, Miss Hartley. I do not want to go and live with Cousin Aldous. I do not even know him." Eleanor gathered the child into her arms without thinking, holding her tightly as Rosalind finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall freely. Over the girl's head, Eleanor's mind raced through the implications of what she had just heard. A distant relative, seizing upon the household's recent unguarded moment of laughter, twisting it somehow into evidence of impropriety, using it as a weapon against the very man whose careful, guarded grief had kept this household so rigidly proper for 10 long years that its every rule had calcified into something almost sacred. It was, Eleanor thought with a bitter kind of clarity, a cruel irony that the first genuine joy this house had experienced in a decade should now be used as the very evidence required to destroy it entirely. That evening, Eleanor was summoned to the Duke's study, a place she had never once been invited to enter since her arrival at Ashcombe. She found him standing near the window, his back to the door, his shoulders held with a rigidity that spoke of barely contained strain. "You wish to see me, Your Grace." He turned, and Eleanor was startled by how tired he looked, the careful composure that usually governed his every feature worn thin around the edges, revealing something rawer beneath it. "Sit, Miss Hartley." She did, and he remained standing, pacing a short distance before the window, as though movement itself might help him organize thoughts that had clearly become tangled beyond his usual careful control. "My cousin Aldous has written," he said, without preamble. "He is not a close relation, nor a particularly welcome one, but he holds some standing with the family council that oversees matters of guardianship, should a peer be found unfit to raise his own heir. He has apparently received word, likely through Lady Constance's own correspondence, of an incident at my dinner table 3 weeks past. He characterizes it as evidence of an improperly run household. He specifically names you, Miss Hartley, as an unsuitable influence, given your reduced circumstances and your apparent lack of respect for established boundaries between staff and family." Eleanor felt her stomach drop, though she kept her expression as steady as she could manage. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I never intended for anything I did to place Rosalind at risk. I know that," he said, more sharply than he perhaps intended, before catching himself and softening slightly. "I know that, Miss Hartley. This is not a matter of your intentions. It is a matter of how easily intentions can be twisted by those seeking a convenient excuse." He stopped his pacing and faced her directly. "My cousin does not care about propriety. He cares about Ashcombe's income and the influence that comes with controlling a duke's heir until her majority. This has always been about opportunity, not concern, but opportunity is precisely what I have handed him, however unwittingly." "What will you do?" Eleanor asked quietly. The Duke was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes distant, fixed on something beyond the window that Eleanor could not see. "I have spent 10 years, Miss Hartley, building a household so carefully proper, so entirely beyond reproach, that no one could ever question my fitness to raise my daughter. Every rule in this house, every guarded silence, every careful distance I have maintained, all of it was built for exactly this purpose, to protect her from precisely this kind of attack." His voice cracked slightly on the final words, an unusual roughness that Eleanor had never heard from him before. "And in a single evening, a single unguarded moment, I handed my cousin the very weapon he needed to threaten everything I have spent a decade protecting. That is not fair," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself. You are not being attacked because your household became improper. You are being attacked because for one evening it became human, and there is a considerable difference between the two, whatever your cousin claims. Fairness has very little to do with the law, Miss Hartley, the Duke said grimly. My cousin needs only to convince the family council that reasonable doubt exists regarding my fitness. He does not need to prove impropriety. He need only suggest it convincingly enough. In the days that followed, the household at Ashcombe Hall retreated into a tension unlike anything Eleanor had experienced since her arrival. The Duke grew distant with her in a way that felt deliberate rather than merely habitual, as though he had decided the safest course was to sever whatever fragile connection had begun to form between them, believing perhaps that this might starve his cousin's accusations of any remaining substance. He no longer paused near the schoolroom door in the mornings. He no longer asked Rosalind small questions about her lessons at dinner. He returned, almost entirely, to the rigid, careful silence that had governed the house before Eleanor's arrival, and Eleanor watched with a growing ache in her chest as Rosalind, sensing the shift immediately, retreated back into her own careful watchfulness as well. The brief blossoming Eleanor had witnessed over these past weeks, folding closed again like a flower, deprived too suddenly of sunlight. He thinks distance will protect us, Rosalind said one evening, with a perceptiveness that startled Eleanor anew. But I do not think it is working. I think it is only making everyone sadder. Eleanor privately agreed, though she did not say so aloud, unwilling to add to the child's already considerable burden of worry. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived nearly 2 weeks later, at a formal gathering the Duke had reluctantly agreed to host, at his cousin's insistence, so that Lord Aldous Fenwick might personally observe the household he intended to condemn. Several members of the family council attended as well, elderly relatives whose opinions, Eleanor understood, would carry considerable weight in whatever decision was eventually reached regarding Rosalind's future. Lord Aldous proved to be a smooth, well-spoken man of perhaps 50, with an easy, practiced charm that Eleanor distrusted the moment she was introduced to him. He spoke at length over dinner about family obligation, about propriety, about the delicate reputation of noble households, all delivered with a solicitous concern that Eleanor found deeply, quietly menacing beneath its polished surface. I mean no offense to you personally, Miss Hartley, he said at one point, his tone dripping with false warmth, but surely you understand how such an incident might appear to outside observers, a companion of reduced circumstances, provoking laughter from a grieving Duke at his own dinner table, in front of assembled family. It raises questions, does it not, about the nature of your influence in this household? It raises questions only for those determined to find scandal in ordinary human warmth, my lord, Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. I made an embarrassing mistake with a decanter of wine and a poorly considered joke. That His Grace found it amusing speaks to his own good humor, not to any impropriety on my part. Good humor, Lord Aldous repeated, with a thin smile. How curious a phrase, given that this household has been known for a decade to possess none whatsoever. It was at this moment, watching his daughter's growing distress across the table, and Eleanor's carefully maintained composure fraying at its edges under his cousin's relentless probing, that something in the Duke of Ashcombe finally shifted. He set down his glass, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight and clarity that silenced the entire table. Enough, Aldous. The room fell still. Even Lord Aldous's practiced smile faltered slightly at the unexpected sharpness in his cousin's tone. You have questioned my household's propriety, my daughter's welfare, and Miss Hartley's character for the better part of this evening, under the guise of concern that I do not for one moment believe you genuinely feel, the Duke continued, rising from his chair. You have suggested that a moment of laughter at my own table constitutes evidence of unfitness, when in truth, that laughter was the first sign of life this household has shown in 10 years. I have spent a decade so consumed by grief, and so determined to prove my own fitness through rigid, joyless propriety, that I nearly forgot my daughter needs more from me than perfect conduct. She needs warmth. She needs to hear laughter in her own home occasionally, rather than silence dressed up as respectability. He turned his gaze to Rosalind, whose eyes had filled once again with tears, though these seemed different from the frightened tears of weeks before. Miss Hartley did not corrupt this household, Aldous. She reminded it how to breathe, and I will not apologize for that. Not to you, not to the family council, not to anyone who mistakes joy for scandal, simply because they have forgotten what genuine care for a child actually looks like. The silence that followed was profound, broken finally by one of the elderly council members, a stern-faced woman who had said little throughout the entire evening, clearing her throat and offering a small, approving nod. Well said, Edmund, she remarked. I confess I have wondered these 10 years past whether this house had forgotten how to live. It is reassuring to learn it has not. Lord Aldous, sensing the tide of the room turning firmly against him, made a final, weak attempt to salvage his position, but found little support among the assembled relatives, several of whom now regarded him with open skepticism regarding his true motives. Within the week, word arrived that his petition to the family council had been formally withdrawn, its foundation too flimsy to withstand serious scrutiny once examined honestly. That night, after the guests had finally departed, and the house had settled once more into quiet, Eleanor found the Duke standing near the staircase, before the portrait of his late wife, exactly where Peggy had once told her he paused each morning without ever admitting to it. "Thank you," she said softly, approaching him carefully, "for what you said at dinner." He did not look away from the portrait immediately. "I meant every word of it," he said. "I have spent 10 years believing that grief required perfect stillness, perfect control, as though feeling anything else would somehow betray what I lost." He finally turned to face her, and something in his gray eyes had softened in a way Eleanor had never witnessed before. "You proved me wrong, Miss Hartley, quite by accident, and I find I am no longer certain I wish to return to how things were before." Eleanor's heart quickened at the quiet honesty in his voice, though she said nothing yet, sensing that he had more to say, and that interrupting him now would only send him retreating back behind the careful walls he had only just begun, tentatively, to lower. "When Catherine died," he continued, his voice low, as though the words cost him something to release, "I believed that grieving her properly meant never allowing myself to feel lightly again. I thought joy would be a kind of forgetting, and I could not bear the idea of forgetting her, not even a little. So I built this house into something as still and careful as a held breath, and I told myself that stillness was loyalty." He glanced back toward the portrait, its gentle, unguarded smile watching over them both in the candlelight. "It took my own daughter's tears tonight, and my own laughter 3 weeks past, to show me how wrong I had been. Catherine was never still, Miss Hartley. She filled every room she entered, just as my aunt so unkindly reminded us. I do not honor her memory by starving this house of the very things she brought to it. I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that grief and joy are not always opposites, Your Grace. Sometimes they simply learn to live in the same room together, if we let them." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his gray eyes, before a faint, genuine warmth touched the corner of his mouth. Not the sudden, startled laugh of weeks before, but something quieter and steadier. A small light kindled, rather than a spark struck by accident. "I begin to think you may be right," he said, "though I suspect it will take more practice than I currently possess." "Practice can be arranged, Your Grace," Eleanor said, allowing herself a small smile of her own. "I have been told I am rather good at disrupting careful silences." "So I have noticed," he said, and this time there was no mistaking the warmth in his voice, nor the way his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than strict propriety required. He said nothing further that night, turning instead toward his study with a quiet good evening. But Eleanor stood alone before the portrait for some time afterward, her heart unsteady in a way she had not expected, and she wondered, with a mixture of hope and uncertainty she could not quite untangle, what exactly had shifted between them in that quiet corridor, and where it might yet lead them both. Spring came early to Ashcombe that year, or perhaps it only seemed that way to Eleanor, who found herself noticing small signs of new growth everywhere she looked in the weeks following Lord Aldous Fenwick's failed petition, as though the entire estate had been waiting, just as its master had, for permission to bloom again. The changes in the household were subtle at first, small enough that only someone who had lived closely alongside its careful rhythms for months would have noticed them at all. The Duke began taking his morning coffee in the smaller breakfast room, rather than alone in his study, a room that happened to adjoin the schoolroom, and he began, with increasing frequency, finding small reasons to look in on Rosalind's lessons before continuing on to his daily business with the estate. "He asked me yesterday what I thought of the poem we studied," Rosalind told Eleanor one morning, practically glowing with the novelty of it. "He asked what I thought, Miss Hartley, not simply whether I had memorized it correctly. No one has ever asked me that before." Eleanor watched the child's excitement with a warmth of her own, though she was careful, in these weeks, not to read too much into every small shift she observed in the Duke's behavior. She reminded herself, more than once, that gratitude and genuine affection could sometimes resemble each other closely enough to be mistaken, and that a man freshly emerged from 10 years of careful grief might easily confuse relief for something deeper, something that might fade once the immediate crisis of his cousin's threat had properly passed. And yet, there were moments that resisted such careful, cautious explanation. She noticed the way the Duke had begun seeking her out in the evenings, not always with any particular business to discuss, simply appearing in the library where she often read after Rosalind had been put to bed, settling into the chair across from hers with a book of his own that he rarely seemed to actually read, his attention drifting instead, again and again, toward her. "You are staring, Your Grace," she said one such evening, not looking up from her own book, though a small smile had begun tugging at her mouth. "I am considering a difficult passage," he said, though the book in his hands had not had a single page turned in the better part of an hour. "You have been considering the same difficult passage since before dinner." "It is a very complicated passage," he said, with a gravity so obviously false that Eleanor finally looked up, laughing despite herself, and found him watching her, with an expression that made her breath catch slightly in her throat, something open and unguarded, that she had rarely seen him allow himself since that first accidental laugh at the dinner table months before. "Edmund," she said, using his given name for the first time, testing the shape of it carefully. "If you have something you wish to say to me, I would rather you simply say it, than continue pretending an interest in a book you have not read a single word of this evening." He set the book aside entirely then, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all, simply studying her, with an intensity that made her heart quicken further still. "I do not know precisely how to say it, Eleanor," he admitted finally, and something in the way he used her given name in return, softly, almost carefully, as though testing whether he had earned the right to it, undid whatever remaining composure she had been holding on to. "I have spent 10 years believing myself incapable of feeling anything beyond duty and grief, and I built my entire life around that belief so thoroughly that I nearly forgot how to recognize what I felt for you as anything other than gratitude for what you brought back to this house." "And now?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I find that gratitude does not adequately explain why I think of you at every hour of the day that we are apart," he said. "It does not explain why I find myself inventing reasons to sit in this library each evening, nor why the sound of your laughter has become, without my fully realizing it, the thing I most look forward to at the end of every difficult day. I believe, Eleanor, that what I feel for you has grown into something considerably more than gratitude, though I confess the admission frightens me somewhat, given how carefully I have guarded myself against feeling anything at all for so very long." Eleanor set her own book aside, her hands not entirely steady. "It frightens me as well," she said honestly. "I came to this house believing I would simply teach your daughter her letters and her sums, and instead I find myself hopelessly, foolishly attached to an entire household I never expected to love, as I have come to love it, to a daughter who is not my own, and to a father who, until a few months ago, I was fairly certain did not know how to smile. I am told," the Duke said, a genuine warmth touching his voice now, "that I have improved somewhat in that particular skill, thanks to a rather persistent companion who refused to accept my silences at face value." "I have been told the same," Eleanor said, smiling properly now. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, gently, as though asking permission with the gesture itself rather than presuming it granted, and Eleanor let him, her fingers curling around his without hesitation. "I do not wish to rush you, Eleanor," he said quietly. "You deserve courtship conducted properly, not hurried declarations made in a library at an unreasonable hour, simply because I have finally found the courage to say what I have felt for some weeks now. But I did not wish to spend one more evening pretending to read a book I have no interest in, when what I truly wished to do was tell you plainly that you have changed everything in this house, and in me, and that I find I am no longer willing to let that change go unacknowledged between us." "I appreciate the sentiment of proper courtship," Eleanor said, laughing softly despite the tears that had gathered unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "But I think, Edmund, that we have already spent rather a long time being careful and proper in this house, and I find I have grown somewhat tired of it. I would rather simply tell you that I have loved you, quietly and against my own better judgment, since somewhere around the evening you laughed at my ridiculous imitation of your aunt, and that I have no particular wish to wait a great deal longer before admitting it plainly." The Duke of Ashcombe smiled then, fully and without restraint, a smile that Eleanor suspected very few people beyond herself and, increasingly, his own daughter had been permitted to witness in these past 10 years, and he leaned forward and kissed her gently, carefully, as though she were something precious he still could not quite believe he was allowed to hold. The weeks between that quiet evening in the library and the formal announcement of their engagement were, for Eleanor, unlike any she had known before. She had grown so accustomed to careful restraint at Ashcombe Hall, to weighing every word before it left her mouth for fear of disturbing some fragile balance within the household, that she found it almost startling how naturally warmth now seemed to move through the same rooms that had once felt so heavy with silence. The Duke insisted, gently but firmly, on observing a proper period of courtship before any formal announcement was made, a decision Eleanor privately suspected had less to do with propriety and more to do with his own careful nature. The same instinct that had once led him to build an entire household around rigid control, now redirected toward ensuring that what had grown between them was steady and true, rather than a passing reaction to sudden relief. She did not mind the wait. If anything, she found herself grateful for it gave her the chance to watch him change in small, unhurried increments, each one more convincing than any hurried declaration could have been. He began riding out with Rosalind on Sunday afternoons, something he had not done since before the accident, according to Peggy, who reported this development to Eleanor with barely contained delight. He began inviting tenant families to small gatherings on the estate grounds, gatherings that had once been conducted through cold, formal correspondence rather than face-to-face warmth. He even, on one particularly memorable evening, sat at the pianoforte in the drawing room, an instrument that had gathered dust for a decade, and picked out a simple, halting tune that Rosalind later confirmed had been one of her mother's favorites, played imperfectly and with evident rust, but played nonetheless, filling the room with music it had not held in 10 long years. Eleanor stood in the doorway that evening, watching father and daughter together at the instrument, Rosalind's small hands guiding his through the parts he had forgotten, and she felt, more strongly than at any other moment since her arrival, that she was witnessing something being carefully, deliberately rebuilt, note by note, rather than simply repaired. "You are staring again," the Duke said, without turning from the keys, a faint smile evident in his voice. "I have found I rather enjoy staring at this particular site," Eleanor admitted, and Rosalind giggled, delighted, and demanded that her father attempt the tune once more from the beginning, which he did, with considerably more patience than Eleanor suspected he had once possessed for anything requiring imperfection. News of their engagement, when it was formally announced some weeks later, spread through the county with considerably more speed and considerably more approval than Lady Constance's earlier complaints had ever managed to generate. Even Lady Constance herself, upon receiving the news, sent a letter that was, by her own considerable standards, almost warm, remarking only that she had always known Edmund required a woman with a firm hand and an unfortunate fondness for plain speaking, and that she supposed Miss Hartley would suffice adequately in that role. Rosalind's reaction proved considerably less restrained. She had, by this point, come to regard Eleanor with an affection that had grown steadily beyond mere fondness for a kind companion into something closer to the love a daughter holds for a mother, though Eleanor was always careful never to presume the title before Rosalind offered it herself. "Does this mean you will stay forever now?" Rosalind asked, the evening the engagement was announced, her eyes bright with a hope she no longer felt any need to guard carefully against disappointment. "I intend to, if you will have me," Eleanor said, kneeling down to meet the child's eyes properly, as she had done on that very first day in the sitting room, so many months before. "For as long as you and your father will allow it." "Forever, then," Rosalind said firmly, throwing her arms around Eleanor's neck with an openness that would have seemed impossible from the careful, guarded child Eleanor had first met, arranging her wooden blocks into rows rather than building anything joyful with them. The wedding itself, held the following autumn in the small chapel on the Ashcombe estate, was a quiet affair by the standards of the aristocracy, though Eleanor privately thought it was exactly the sort of celebration the house had needed for a very long time. The chapel was filled not with the careful, formal silence that had once governed every corner of Ashcombe Hall, but with warmth and conversation, and, most remarkably of all, laughter, spilling freely from guests who had spent the better part of a decade believing such sounds no longer belonged within these walls. The Duke, standing at the altar as Eleanor made her way toward him, wore an expression that Peggy would later describe to the younger kitchen staff, with considerable wonder in her voice, as the most open and unguarded she had ever witnessed on his face, more even than the accidental laugh that had first cracked open his careful composure all those months before. It was not merely happiness, though happiness was certainly present in it. It was something closer to peace, the particular peace of a man who had finally allowed himself to stop treating grief and joy as enemies locked in permanent opposition, and had instead learned, slowly and with considerable difficulty, to let them share the same quiet room within his heart. That evening, as the wedding guests finally departed and the great house settled once more into its familiar quiet, though a quiet far gentler now than the heavy silence it had once carried for 10 long years, Eleanor found herself standing once again before the portrait of the late Duchess on the staircase, her husband's hand resting warmly in her own. "Do you think she would approve?" Eleanor asked softly, studying the gentle, unguarded smile that had first caught her attention on her very first day at Ashcombe Hall. "I think," Edmund said after a thoughtful pause, "that Catherine would be glad, more than anything else, to know that Rosalind laughs freely now, and that this house has remembered how to hold both grief and joy within it, rather than choosing one at the expense of the other. I think she would recognize, in you, something of her own spirit, the very thing that first drew me to her all those years ago, and I believe she would be grateful, rather than jealous, that this house found its way back to warmth." Eleanor said nothing further, simply resting her head against his shoulder as they stood together before the portrait, and somewhere down the corridor, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of Rosalind's laughter carrying through the halls of Ashcombe, no longer a rare and startling thing, but an ordinary, everyday sound, woven now into the very fabric of the house itself. In the years that followed, visitors to Ashcombe Hall would often remark, with some surprise, on how different the estate felt from the stories they had heard of it in years past, stories of a grieving duke and a silent house wrapped permanently in careful mourning. They would remark on the sound of music occasionally drifting from the drawing room in the evenings, on the easy warmth between the duke and his wife, on the bright, curious daughter who had grown, under her stepmother's steady encouragement, into a young woman entirely unafraid to speak her own mind, however inconvenient the timing. And though the Duke of Ashcombe would never again become a man prone to sudden, uncontrolled outbursts of laughter, preferring instead the quieter, steadier warmth he had come to cultivate alongside his wife, those who knew the family well would occasionally catch him smiling at some small, ordinary moment, watching his wife across a room or listening to his daughter's chatter over dinner, a smile so natural and unguarded that it seemed, to anyone who had known him during those long, silent years, like the most remarkable thing in the world. Even Lord Aldous Fenwick, whose failed petition had once threatened to unravel everything the household had only just begun to rebuild, found himself, some years later, seated at Ashcombe's table once more, this time as an ordinary guest rather than an accuser, invited by the Duke himself in a gesture of quiet, deliberate forgiveness that Eleanor had gently encouraged, believing that a house rebuilt on warmth had little use for old grudges carried forward out of habit. Lord Aldous, to his credit, had the grace to look faintly embarrassed throughout the visit, and made no further mention of impropriety or unsuitable influence, watching instead, with something like reluctant admiration, as Rosalind chattered happily through the meal, and the Duke reached, without any apparent self-consciousness at all, for his wife's hand beneath the table. It had taken in the end nothing more than a spilled decanter of wine and a moment of flustered, accidental honesty to begin cracking open 10 years of carefully guarded grief. But it had taken far more than that single evening, months of patience and small, stubborn warmth offered again and again despite every careful wall raised against it, to finally teach the Duke of Ashcombe that laughter, once returned to a house, need never be feared as a betrayal of what had been lost, but welcomed instead as proof that love, in all its forms, had simply found a new way to live on.